So today we're going to be talking about the inclusive code base, and we'll dwell on engineering accessibility in open source software. While accessibility can go in multiple directions when you're talking about accessibility, we always focus on end users, right? And there's an interesting demographic that we often don't talk about. Do you know that 1 out of every 200 software developers is blind? That's a very interesting fact, and I came across that while researching this topic. Why should you care about that? I mean, if you have one software developer that's blind in every 200, and we're talking about open source, you do not know who might contribute to your code base, and that's why we should be talking about this topic. I am Olwe Bube. You can call me Bube because my name is a bit difficult to pronounce. I am a DevRel engineer, and I have 8+ years of experience working as a software engineer and also leading engineering teams. I also contribute to a number of open source projects, including Kubernetes, Kairos, and Open Source Community Africa. Imagine for a moment that you have a niece or a nephew that wants to pursue programming, but they are blind. How do you help this niece or nephew or friend of yours be able to achieve their dreams of being a programmer? This is why building inclusive code bases is very important. We already talked about the stats, and it's out there in the open. By the way, the stat about one software engineer in every 200 being blind is from a Stack Overflow survey that happened in 2017. So you can actually check that out. Like I said initially, in open source, you don't know who is contributing, and this is why we need to make sure that our code bases are inclusive. So what's the current state of engineering accessibility in open source? It's actually mixed. Because I've worked with a range of open source projects and products, I know that some open source projects are doing a really good job, making sure that when people want to contribute, they can actually contribute. But then I also work with some open source projects that are just focused on pushing features out and making sure that things get done. So it's a mixed landscape. And because of this, I know that more work can be done. Like, we can do a lot more. There are still gaps. So what do we do to build accessible software to make sure that this niece of yours or nephew or friend or whoever that might be actually is able to contribute? I'm going to be zooming in on 3 important topics. And the first one is the code base. So when we talk about the code base, for you to understand this properly, imagine that someone is reading out your code to you. Can you just imagine that for a second? Close your eyes and imagine that you've written a piece of code or software and somebody has to read that out to you. A lot of the blind people actually use speech to text, and this is their reality every day. A software has to read out each line of code. They have to remember every line. They have to remember all variables. They have to remember file names, because these are the things that give them context. So in order for us to be fair to these people, we need to make sure that our naming conventions are very memorable. With the example on the screen, is it easier to remember import get search text? I mean, when you say get search text, it kind of gives you context about what we're going to talk about, right? But when you say import s, for example, from utils, like, that does not make any sense. So it's our collective responsibility to make sure that when we are naming whether variables, files, functions, we actually use meaningful names to help those people that have disability, especially the blind. Aside that, we also need to add a lot of comments. For us, who do not need to use other softwares to read out our code to us, we still get a lot of context from comments in code. It is twice as hard for someone that's blind. So the next time that you're contributing to a code base, please think about these things, not just as maybe something you'd like to do, but as a moral responsibility. The next theme that I want to zoom in on is the WCAG 2.2 standards. And this is the area that a lot of people focus on. In different talks about accessibility, we most times focus on what the WCAG has set as standards, right? But then beyond that, there's also other things. But then back to the WCAG CAG standards, it recommends that you use headings where you should actually use headings. You use sections for sections and not just divs for everything, because divs are easier to use. Again, because these people use screen readers or text-to-speech software, using alt tags is very important. And we can go on and on about that, because this is mostly focused on, there's a lot of things to be said about the WCAG standard. You can actually look that up. I've added the link there. And lastly, I want to talk about the pull request culture. Again, close your eyes for a moment and imagine that your pull request has to be read out to you. Imagine that a pull request has been raised on GitHub and it has to be read to you. You can imagine how difficult that is. So make use of descriptive PRs. For some people, they say it takes a lot of time to add all the description and to put in all the details, but there are people that actually need that. Even if you don't need it, there are people that need it. So when you raise a PR, please make it as descriptive as possible, because that's what gives context to the changes that you've made on the code base to somebody who cannot readily read this the same way that we do. Also, smaller PRs. Imagine that someone raises a PR and there are 45 files changed. Like, large PRs scare me as somebody that does not have a disability. And you can imagine what that looks like for somebody with a disability, especially the blind. So please make your PR smaller. Make sure that it's contextual. It doesn't need to be big. So I'm going to talk about the role that community plays in accessibility. If you look at the community, most of the new things that we push out there are actually driven and advocated for by the community. So as a company, as an organization, as an individual that builds open source software, we need to educate the community around our product and make sure that they are thinking about these things proactively, as opposed to being reactive about it. So I noticed that, as individuals, we learn when we actually have these people in our community. So if you find somebody that has a disability and wants to be a programmer, or is coming up and wants to be a part of your project, please make sure that you include them in make sure that you bring them in, and they're going to drive a lot of the change that you're looking at making. While there's a lot to be said, like there's still a lot of things to be said on this topic, the main aim of this talk is to actually spark your curiosity and to make sure that you're thinking about building code bases that people who are disabled feel welcome to contribute to. Thank you for your time.